He assumed he was exempt from the rules that everyone else follows. However, in one foolish second a cop's choice would obliterate not just an honest man's life yet his own. Only 2 minutes in the wake of making a capture everything changed and the man in uniform lost everything. Before we start the story, remark underneath and let us know where you're watching from today, and in the event that you partake in this video, remember to buy in so you miss no future refreshes. It was simply one more common evening in the city, with individuals hustling through the roads attempting to finish their tasks before the day finished. The sun was high, the air warm, and the typical hints of vehicle horns and road gab consumed the space. For Marcus, a customary person coming back from the store, it seemed like some other day. He just purchased a couple of regular food items, the same old thing. He was strolling down the walkway, out to lunch about the supper he was going to make, when he saw the blazing lights of a squad car pull up behind him. With no advance notice, the official in the vehicle ventured out. Official Harris. At first Marcus didn't appreciate it. Perhaps the official was simply halting to ask something or unsure. All was great, yet when Official Harris shouted to him, Marcus felt a bunch structure in his stomach. Hello, you stop. In that general area, Harris yelled, his voice sharp and directing. Marcus turned confounded. Is something off base? Official Harris didn't answer. Mercifully, you're set to be locked up for intruding. Step here. Marcus was shocked. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't on confidential property or overstepping any regulations. He was simply heading back home like every other person. His mind dashed as he attempted to sort out the thing was occurring. He attempted to account for himself. However, Harris wasn't listening. I did nothing off base. Official, I'm simply attempting to return home, Marcus expressed, attempting to remain mentally collected, yet Harris wasn't keen on listening to him. With no advance notice, Harris snatched Marcus' arm and yanked him towards the vehicle. Marcus pulled back, his disarray transforming into disappointment. What is happening? For what reason am I being captured? He asked, his voice shaking. The official didn't reply. Rather, Harris got considerably more forceful, pushing Marcus towards the vehicle. Individuals close by began seeing, and a couple of spectators started taking out their telephones, detecting that something wasn't correct. Marcus attempted to remain creative, however the circumstance was raising quick. He didn't know it yet, however the second would change all that. In the following couple of minutes, Marcus' life and Official Harris' profession would both be changed everlastingly, as Official Harris powerfully pulled Marcus close to the watch vehicle. The group around them started to become. The strain was thick all around. Individuals murmured, some trading anxious looks, uncertain whether they ought to mediate or simply avoid it. Marcus, actually attempting to figure out the thing was occurring, felt his heart race. He hadn't successfully merited this treatment yet. The more he attempted to make sense of the angrier Official Harris appeared to get. Quit opposing. You believe I'm playing with you? Harris snapped, his voice brutal. The grasp on Marcus' arm fixed, and the official pushed him against the side of the squad car. Marcus, still in dismay, attempted to shout out again, please, I haven't done anything wrong, I'm simply attempting to return home, he said, his voice scarcely above a murmur, as though attempting to dissuade the official's fury. Yet there was no prevailing upon Official Harris. The more he attempted to clutch his poise, the more Harris appeared to let completely go. The official's indignation erupted, and without advance notice he hammered Marcus' hands behind his back and bound him. Generally, people watching from a good ways started to mumble in dismay, yet nobody ventured forward. They understood what happened when you tested a cop, particularly in the dislocal. It was more straightforward to simply remain quiet and trust things would sort themselves out. Similarly, as Harris was going to push Marcus into the rear of the watch vehicle, a voice sliced through the disarray. Hello, what on God's green earth is going on? A man yelled from the group, his telephone held high recording the scene. The official froze briefly, and afterward in that second something moved. A little piece of Harris' certainty broke. He looked around, seeing the telephone in the man's hand, and his face contorted in dissatisfaction. Briefly Harris faltered, however, at that point, as though concluding it didn't make any difference. He turned his consideration back to Marcus, excusing the group as though they were imperceptible. Much to his dismay, the telephone, that solitary recording, would be the way to all that. Marcus, still in shock, at last figured out how to say something he hadn't thought he'd need to. You're committing an error, official, I pledge to you I'm honest. However, Harris wasn't tuning in any longer. He just pushed Marcus into the rear of the vehicle and forcefully closed the entryway, not understanding that his error had as of now been reported so that the world might see promptly after the capture what is happening started to unfurl in manners. Official Harris could never have anticipated the video of Marcus being pushed into the watch vehicle spread like quickly at first it was only a couple of individuals sharing it via online entertainment. However, in a little while it raised a ruckus around town. News sources starting shock from anyone who had seen it. The clasp showed the officials forceful conduct the unpleasantness of the capture, and Marcus endeavors to make sense of that he hadn't done anything wrong. The video grabbed the eye of a few conspicuous virtual entertainment accounts and soon hashtags like #equity for Marcus. Furthermore, police misuse were moving. Individuals couldn't really accept that what they were seeing. How should an official carry on like this out so everyone can see before such countless observers and with no unmistakable explanation? Was this truly occurring back at the station? Official Harris had no clue the firestorm he touched off. He was as yet centered around getting the desk work for the capture done, figuring it would be another standard day in the workplace. He had no clue about that inside the following couple of hours everything would come crashing down. The primary difficult situation came when his telephone hummed with a warning. It was a message from his accomplice Official Johnson. The video is all over virtual entertainment. The is awful, genuine, terrible. Harris froze. The heaviness of the circumstance hit him with a crushing weight. He promptly turned on the news just to see the video of Marcus' capture playing. On the screen a commentator was discussing the occurrence with individuals fighting external the police division. The annoyance was substantial. Harris felt his stomach agitate. The last thing he anticipated was to be the subject of public shock. At that point he started to understand the seriousness of his mix-up. This wasn't simply a minor misconstruing that would be hidden where no one will think to look. This was changed. The city was watching, and this video was spreading quicker than he might have at any point envisioned. He thought about his vocation, his notoriety, and the tension from his bosses that would definitely follow. However, by then it was past the point of no return. The harm was at that point finished when the Inner Undertakings Division started investigating the recording. Harris knew that his activities were under an examination. What he had thought would be a standard day was rapidly transforming into the start of the end for him. His profession, his pride, and his future were all barely surviving one string that he had quite recently snapped with his own hands. The next hours were a haze for Official Harris. His telephone rang, constant calls from individual officials, division authorities, and even relatives generally attempting to find solutions. However, Harris had no responses. The video was wherever it was all anybody could discuss. He attempted to legitimize his activities to himself. Perhaps Marcus had been acting dubious. Perhaps he had missed something seemingly out of the blue. However, where it counts, he realized it didn't make any difference. The harm was at that point done. The police office moved quickly when Harris got a call from his unrivaled Commander Reynolds. The choice had previously been made. Harris, we're suspending you forthcoming an examination. You want to come in? At this point Reynolds said, his voice cold. Harris' heart sank. He was paralyzed. He had never been suspended before, not for anything. The heaviness of the words hit him harder than any disciplinary activity at any point could. Suspended forthcoming examination. He sat in his watch vehicle for quite a while later that call, gazing at the road outside, realizing he was at that point being judged. The swarms shocked. The viral video, the fights, everything felt like it was shutting in on him. Harris had never felt so alone. He could as of now envision the titles toward the beginning of the day. News cop got on video ruthlessly capturing honest man. He could see the irate swarms outside the division requesting equity. He could feel the tension building from each bearing. By the time Harris showed up at the station, things were at that point beyond his control. Officials were murmuring in the lobbies, some giving him sidelong looks. He strolled past them, attempting to hold his head high, yet he could feel the heaviness of their steps. They weren't taking a gander at him the same way any longer. He could tell they new reality. He had screwed up, and it wasn't simply a little misstep. This was large. Inside the station, Chief Reynolds was hanging tight for him in his office. The skipper burned through no time. We've watched the video, Harris. We're beginning an inward examination. It doesn't look great. This could cost you your work. The words hit Harris like a fold. His chest fixed, his hands gripped at his sides. I did nothing off base, he attempted to make sense of, again his voice breaking, yet the commander didn't answer. Rather, Reynolds gave him a long look as though gauging something weighty, then he moaned, "You've been a cop for north of 10 years, Harris. You ought to have known better. You're a carefully prepared official. You ought to have raised, not heightened, what happened today. This isn't simply about you. This is about the trust individuals have in the police, and at the present time you've annihilated that trust." The word stung. Harris didn't have the foggiest idea what to say. There was no guard. There was not a good reason. The main thing left was the cruel truth. His vocation, the existence he had constructed, was disintegrating right in front of him. By the following morning the story had gone public. Media sources from everywhere the nation were covering the capture, showing the now notorious video of official Harris mistreating Marcus. The public shock was overpowering. Individuals from all strolls of life were communicating their annoyance, not just about the severity of the capture, yet about the unmitigated dismissal for the privileges of a blameless individual. The hashtags continued to drift and the tension on the police office strengthened inside the division. The state of mind had moved. What had been a gathering of officials cooperating now felt more like a group of individuals, everyone unobtrusively watching the others. Harris' associates, the ones who used to talk with him during looks away, they were all sitting tight for the unavoidable aftermath, and however much they attempted to stay away, murmurs regarding the episode spread like quickly through the structure. It wasn't simply Harris' work on the line any longer, it was the division's notoriety. The call came early. Commander Reynolds had been informed by the higher-up, and presently the choice was conclusive. "Harris, we're letting you go," Reynolds said straight, successful, quickly. The words scarcely enlisted to Harris. His body went numb as the chief's voice kept illustrating the conventions of his end. Harris remained there in his uniform, attempting to get a handle on the thing was going on. However, it felt dreamlike. Only hours before he had been a cop, a man with deference and authority. Now he was just a previous cop with a demolished standing. As Harris assembled his things, his psyche continued onward back to Marcus. What had he been thinking when he made the capture? Why had he rushed to respond? So anxious to make a statement. He ought to have realized better. He ought to have paid attention to Marcus when he said he was blameless. However, presently it was past the point where it is possible to return and change anything. When he left the structure, maybe the heaviness of the world was on his shoulders. As he strolled to his vehicle he saw the columnists accumulated external. The station cameras pointed his direction. He could hear the weak snap of shades as they took pictures of him, leaving his face a blend of doubt and skepticism. His whole profession, all that he had worked for, was presently decreased to a couple of seconds got on camera. A vocation based on long periods of administration had finished in a moment, and it wasn't simply his position in question now. The media had gotten on his own set of experiences, his previous captures, grievances about his direct and even gossipy tidbits about earlier cases of unnecessary power. The video had opened up a conduit of investigation, and Harris couldn't get away from it. Wherever he turned, there it was: his face, his activities, his defeat. He didn't have the opportunity to handle what had simply occurred before. The public clamor transformed into something different. Expert nonconformists appeared external the police headquarters, requesting equity for Marcus and calling for police responsibility. The office needed to meet up. Security stressed that things would heighten further, and in the midst of all of this bedlam, Harris could just look as his reality disintegrated. The incongruity wasn't lost on him. He had once been the one making an appearance to control the bedlam. Now he was the person who had caused it. As the day delayed, the public shock kept on developing. The fights outside the police headquarters escalated. Individuals from all strolls of life, families, activists, even individuals who had never fought before, accumulated to voice their resentment regarding what had happened. Signs requesting equity for Marcus were held high, with messages like "No equity, no harmony," and "End police severity" painted in striking letters. The opportunity developed stronger and more powerful as time passes. Marcus, as far as it matters for him, had been delivered. Soon thereafter the charges against him had been dropped, yet that didn't mean the harm was scattered. His face too had become known to millions. The video of the capture had previously ignited a discussion about police severity, racial profiling, and the developing split between policing. The networks they were committed to safeguard Marcus anyway wasn't centered around the public exhibition or the media craze. He was all the while handling the awful experience. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply in some unacceptable spot at some unacceptable time. Yet presently he was left with the profound scars of that capture and the dread that such occurrences could keep on happening to others as the days went by. Harris couldn't get away from the media storm. Each time he turned on the television or opened his telephone, there it was, his face, his name. His destruction. Media sources ran vast tales about the occurrence, showing the video on a circle taking apart his each move. The inclusion was tenacious. He was called everything from an image of police unfortunate behavior to a rebel official. Previous partners removed themselves from him, some in any event, remarking freely that they were disheartened in Harris' activities. The public backfire was so wild that even his own family started to feel the tension. His significant other, who had forever been steady, scarcely addressed him any longer. She needed to manage the judgment and the murmurs of neighbors and companions, all while attempting to keep their youngsters out of the spotlight. Harris' name was currently inseparable from disappointment and shame. The city gathering had required a crisis fulfilling and needs for an autonomous examination concerning police rehearsals developed stronger. Harris was presently not simply a man confronting ramifications for a solitary misstep. He was a piece of a lot bigger discussion about foundational issues inside policing. The more he attempted to stay away from the spotlight, the more it appeared to track down him in the interim at the police division. The aftermath was all the while unfurling. Officials who had once been his partners were presently scrutinizing his activities. The inner examination concerning Harris' lead was advancing rapidly. Observation film from the body cameras, witness proclamations, and the viral video all arranged a similar picture. Harris had acted improperly and his conduct had been unwarranted. The more the office dug, the more inquiries emerged about Harris' judgment. Furthermore, past direct, there were grievances dating back years, murmurs of unnecessary power and reports of unrestrained hostility. It was turning out to be certain that Harris had gained notoriety for pushing limits, and now that standing was getting up to speed to him, the head of police, frantic to recapture the division's believability, offered a public expression denouncing Harris' activities. Also, PR promising responsibility. He guaranteed the public that this sort of conduct wouldn't go on without serious consequences, and that the division was endeavoring to guarantee something like this could at absolutely no point ever occur in the future. Yet Harris knew reality. Regardless of what the division said now, it wouldn't be. An adequate number of his activities had previously discolored the standing of the whole power. Harris sat in his family room that late evening, gazing vacantly at the television, which was all the while broadcasting the fights and news about the occurrence. His reality felt like it was imploding around him. He had continuously accepted that he was making the best choice as a cop, that his job was to secure and serve, yet presently he was the one being judged, and the reality of the situation was he was unable to change what had proactively happened. The profession he had spent over a decade building was gone, eradicated surprisingly fast. The more he contemplated it, the more it seemed like a bad dream he was unable to awaken from. The next days felt like a perpetual haze of meetings, gatherings, and perpetual patterns of media reporting. Harris' name was put across each title, his face an image of everything amiss with policing according to people in general. As the days passed, his suspension became super durable. What's more, the choice to fire him was settled. It wasn't simply the division that had betrayed him. His whole world had moved. The public, his partners, and, surprisingly, his family had all begun to see him from an alternate perspective. One nighttime of attempting to stay away from the media, Harris at long last plunked down with his better half. Lauren, the strain between them had been working since the episode. She hadn't said a lot yet. Harris could feel the heaviness of her quietness. Maybe the whole house had been canvassed in a slight Marcus, however, for the framework that had flopped so many. Harris could see the outrage according to the group, yet in addition something different, something more profound. It wasn't just around one official, it was about an arrangement of force that again and again manhandled the ability to control and scare the individuals who were the most weak. The most awful part was just the office was in harm control mode. Each open assertion made by the boss or the city hall leader appeared to be an endeavor to divert fault. The message from the office was clear: this was an separated occurrence and it wouldn't go on without serious consequences. However, Harris knew reality. The truth wasn't that his activities were an irregularity, it was that the actual framework had permitted officials like him to work without any potential repercussions. He had been essential for a culture that chose to disregard offense, that neglected to address the basic issues that prompted episodes like his. The inner examination proceeded, and as it did, an ever-increasing number of individuals started to approach with their interests about Harris' past conduct. A few previous partners talked about the times they had seen his attitude, his propensity to heighten circumstances rather than erasing them. Some even referenced how they had seen him utilize exorbitant power and before, yet they had never detailed it by the same token. Out of dread of revenge or on the grounds that they felt the division would cover it up, now those equivalent associates were standing up. However, it was past the point of no return. The harm had proactively been done. It didn't help that the media kept on pounding away at the story. Commentators replayed the capture video again and again, analyzing each casing, each snapshot of hostility. There was never a way out for Harris. Each time he checked his telephone or turned on the television, his face was there, his name related with quite possibly of the most questionable second in late memory. It wasn't simply the police force that was watching him, it was the entire world. In the interim, Marcus had become something of a legend. According to the public, the casualty of a crooked capture had been raised to an image of obstruction of voice for the individuals who felt they were routinely designated and abused by policing. Outlets searched him out for interviews, and the web-based entertainment world revitalized behind him, supporting his cases, sharing his story. Yet through it all, Marcus stayed humble. He hadn't searched out notoriety or acknowledgement, he just maintained that equity, Marcus' choice should stand up, had been daring, yet it had moreover freed him up to a new, larger discussion about police change, equity and responsibility. He knew this, and keeping in mind that he felt a feeling of obligation to continue to stand up, he likewise started to feel the heaviness. All things considered, the world was watching him too. He was unable to get away from the steady tokens of what had befallen him either. Yet through it all, Marcus maintained his emphasis on one thing, ensuring that Harris didn't leave this without confronting the full results of his activities. Harris, like many officials before him, should have been considered responsible. He expected to comprehend that what he had done wasn't simply a mix-up, it was a disappointment that impacted something other than Marcus. It impacted the entire local area. For Harris, the snapshot of retribution was coming. The inner examination was approaching its decision, and with it the division was starting to settle on its choices. Plainly, Harris' profession was finished. However, what remained dubious was whether criminal accusations would be recorded. The more the investigation uncovered, the more Harris started to understand that it wasn't simply his work that was in danger. Now his whole future, his opportunity, was in limbo, and regardless of how enthusiastically he attempted to clutch the possibility that he had acted in great confidence, the proof was overpowering. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As Harris sat at home that late evening gazing at similar news film of his capture of Marcus, he was unable to help, in any case, feel like he was suffocating. His profession was over, his standing was destroyed, and more regrettable, the individual he had harmed the most, the man he had unfairly captured, was presently requesting responsibility, and as it should be. Marcus merited equity, and Harris realized that he was the person who needed to follow through on the cost. The choice descended like a hammer. Official Harris' inner examination was finished, and the discoveries were dooming. The division had currently clarified that his activities were reprehensible. The unreasonable power utilized U.S. during Marcus' capture, the complete negligence for convention, and his inability to de-escalate the circumstance were all unmistakable infringement of departmental guidelines. However, what aggravated it was his set of experiences of comparable occurrences, every one hidden where no one will think to look. As of not long ago, what had once been little grievances about his way of behaving had now gathered momentum into a all-out emergency, one that Harris could never again deny or get away from. The police boss made the declaration mid one morning. Official Chris Harris has been ended from the power compelling. Quickly the articulation read: his activities don't mirror the upsides of this division, and he will no more act as a police officer. Harris couldn't carry himself to watch the declaration. He definitely understood what it would. Agree that the words stung, yet they didn't astound him. He had known his destiny since the second the video became famous online. The office had no way out except for to disavow him. The public objection, the tension from activists, and the examination of the media made his position illogical. They needed to make an illustration of him, yet despite the fact that he had expected it, despite the fact that he realized this was coming, the truth of losing his profession was still difficult to get a handle on. It wasn't just about the identification, it was about the personality that he had worked for himself throughout the long term. Harris had consistently seen himself as somebody who maintained the law, somebody who made the roads more secure. He had prided himself on being a decent official, a man who had gained the appreciation of his companions. Presently, in a moment, it was undeniably gone. The heaviness of the circumstance hit him hardest in the peaceful minutes when he was separated from everyone else. With his viewpoints, it wasn't simply the vocation he had lost, it was the trust he had broken. Harris had gone through years attempting to persuade himself that he was a defender, somebody who remained on the right side of the law, yet presently he needed to confront reality. His activities that day were a treachery of all that he once put stock in. He hadn't safeguarded Marcus. He had hurt him, he had manhandled his power and utilized his position to threaten somebody who was guiltless. In the meantime, Marcus, however, as yet managing the result of the capture, ended up at the focal point of a development. He wasn't looking for distinction, yet the world had directed its concentration toward him. Activists from the nation overconnected offering support. Media sources kept on covering his story, outlining him as a casualty of police fierceness, yet additionally as an image of versatility. Individuals started coordinating for change, and Marcus' name became one of the many revitalizing sobs for equity. Obviously, in spite of all that had happened to him, he had turned into a voice for something greater, yet Marcus wasn't centered around the spotlight. As he proceeded with his battle for equity, he continued to ponder what it would take to change things for good. He realized that Harris' end wasn't sufficient. It was a stage, sure, yet it wasn't the end. It was important for a bigger issue, one that required repairing starting from the earliest stage. Single case, regardless of how prominent, would change the framework short term. However, in the event that his story could help flash change, in the event that it could prompt genuine changes in how cops were held responsible, then perhaps there was trust. Harris then again was left to get the bits of his broke life. The term end was just the start. With the division's choice to fire him, criminal allegations were presently a genuine chance. The video had made it clear Harris had acted external the law. The lead prosecutor's office was investigating the situation, and it was just a matter of time before they chose whether or not to squeeze charges. As though losing his profession wasn't sufficient at this point, Harris was confronted with the genuine possibility of confronting legitimate ramifications for his activities in the calm of his condo. He pondered what it would mean in the event that he were charged. Imagine a scenario where he went to prison. Imagine a scenario in which his life, as far as he might be concerned, was annihilated for good. The idea consumed him. There were no simple responses, no real way to fix the harm he had caused. All he had now was the aftermath, the broken trust, the destroyed standing, and the frightful inquiry of how he could have permitted things to get that far. Was obvious to Harris that the outcomes of his activities won't end with his terminating. The tempest was not even close to finished, and he was simply starting to see exactly the way in which profound the harm ran. As the days transformed into weeks, Harris' reality decreased. The public firestorm was not over. It simply appeared to develop as time passes. Media sources, web-based entertainment also, nonconformists, everybody kept on examining him. Each time he left his condo, he felt the heaviness of individuals' eyes on him, as though they could see the disappointment carved all over his loved ones too. Felt the strain his better half, Lauren, had removed considerably further. The contentions had turned out to be more successive, the quiet between them additional, stifling. They were scarcely talking any longer, and in any event, when they did, it generally seemed like a similar inquiry lingered palpably. Now Harris had gone through years persuading himself that being a cop was his reason for living, his motivation, yet presently everything that was no more the identification he wore, the uniform, all that he had related to for such a long time, no longer had any importance. All he had left was the devastating responsibility that accompanied realizing he had harmed somebody, an honest man who had never really merited the treatment he got. Yet it wasn't simply Marcus. Harris' activities had impacted his whole family, his partners, and the local area. He once thought he was making a difference. He had harmed the trust that individuals expected to have in policing. It seemed like the trust could never be fixed. In the meantime, Marcus proceeded with his battle for equity, and Harris could just watch. He had heard from his legal advisor that criminal allegations were presently being truly viewed as the examination concerning his activities was not simply an inward matter, it was presently a lawbreaker case. The recording from the Spectator telephone showing Marcus' unpleasant capture and Harris' animosity had turned into the critical piece of proof. And it wasn't only that, there were the past grievances about Harris Lee, the past episodes where he had utilized unreasonable power, all approaching to light. The more they dove into his record, the more it seemed like Harris had been coasting by for a really long time, protected by the framework. Now the reality of the situation was out, and he was unable to stow away from it. Harris' legal counselor, a man who had been attempting to deal with the wreck of the the circumstance at long last called with the news that Harris had been fearing the lead prosecutor as recording charges. The legal advisor said, his voice level as though he were perusing from a content you're seeing conceivable attack charges and wrongdoing in office. In the event that this goes to preliminary, it could get revolting, and regardless of whether you're absolved, your vocation will be finished. There's no approaching back from this. Harris sat peacefully as the heaviness of the words settled over him. The lawbreaker charges felt like the last nail in the casket. It wasn't simply that he had lost his employment, now his opportunity was in danger. The division had previously disavowed him, however the courts could take all the other things. Envisioning what his was hard life would seem to be after this, whether he could at any point be all ready to hold his head up again. He had crossed a line. Also, presently the results were more extreme than he had at any point expected. As Harris arranged to confront the lawful outcomes of his activities, the local area's reaction was blended. For a few, the charges were a stage toward responsibility and little triumph in the long battle for equity. The fights proceeded and calls for a police change developed stronger. There were the individuals who accepted that Harris terminating and the likely charges against him were simply the starting, that fundamental issues should have been tended to before genuine change could occur for them. This was an emblematic triumph, one little illustration of how the framework was being viewed to be responsible. Be that as it may, for Marcus the circumstance was a long way from straightforward. The consideration he had gotten, both positive and negative, was overpowering. He had never needed to be a image, never needed to be danger or into the spotlight. He had simply needed to go home that day to move on. However, presently he was important for a lot bigger discussion, one about race equity and policing in America. The media cherished a great story, and his story had turned into a revitalizing weep for individuals who felt like they had been overlooked for a really long time. Marcus had been consulted by such countless correspondents, so many media sources, that keeping track the questions was hard. Continuously appeared to circle around a similar subject. How could it feel to be the survivor of police mercilessness? What was it that you need to witness to official Harris? He addressed them all with a similar quiet self-control. Yet, inside he was battling. It wasn't just about him any longer, it was about each individual of color who had been treated unjustifiably by the police, about each individual who had been exposed to racial profiling or fierceness. Marcus realized that this case could act as a defining moment, yet he likewise realized that the street ahead would be long and loaded with challenges. He didn't know what equity resembled any longer. He didn't know what might make things right for every one of the media consideration and public help. Marcus couldn't get away from the aggravation of that day, the sensation of powerlessness. As he was an alleged mistreated by a man to safeguard him, he was unable to fail to remember the manner in which Harris had treated him. Like he wasn't even human. Equity wasn't just about indicting Harris, it was about changing the framework that permitted things like this to occur in any case. As the official procedures moved forward, Marcus zeroed in on the master plan the world was at last paying consideration, yet there was something else to do. There were as yet innumerable stories, like his accounts of individuals who had been violated by the people who should safeguard them, and until things changed on a key level, there was no genuine triumph to celebrate, not yet for Harris. The way forward appeared to be clear, however it was not one he was anxious to walk. He had no deceptions about his future. He had settled on his decisions, and presently he needed to live with them. The fight in court was simply starting. Furthermore, whether he was found blameworthy, it would be quite a while before he could get away from the shadows of his own decisions. His profession was over, his standing was broken, and whether or not he might at any point find recovery, whether he might at any point search in the mirror and be pleased with the man he saw, was something he didn't know. He could at any point have the option to answer. The preliminary lingered over Harris like a foreboding shadow, every day bringing him more like a showdown. He had gone through weeks fearing the lead prosecutor's office had made it clear they were going after him with all that they had. The video film, Marcus' declaration, the mounting proof from past grievances. It was undeniably stacked against him. Harris' legal counselor attempted to set him up for the most terrible, encouraging him to expect a conviction, particularly given the public feeling the media carnival encompassing the case wasn't helping general society, had currently concluded the preliminary was as of now not just around one official's activities. It had turned into a mandate on police severity, on the very connection between policing the networks they filled in. As Harris sat in his legal counselor's office surveying the case, he was unable to shake the inclination that everything had spiraled wild. This was as of now not just about him, this was greater than small-time. One slip-up his whole vocation had prompted this second, the occasion at the point when he understood how delicate his life as a cop had been. He had been a gear tooth and a framework that many felt was broken, hopeless. Regardless of whether he figured out how to stay away from prison, he could never escape the public disgrace. There was no option but to press onward. His name would everlastingly be related with the viral video, with the indignation and dissatisfaction of such countless individuals who had watched it unfurl. The media inclusion of the preliminary turned out to be progressively warmed. It wasn't and simply the melodrama of the police embarrassment any longer. It was the battle for equity, for a framework that could never again bear to deliberately ignore the activities of a couple of troublemakers. The court was loaded with dissidents, allies and spectators, all trusting that this case would be a defining moment. They maintained that Harris should be considered responsible. However, they likewise needed something more, a change. A commitment that no official would pull off mishandling their power again. Inside the court, Harris sat inflexible, attempting to hold his self-restraint. Marcus was on the testimony box, and Harris couldn't resist the opportunity to look as the man he had violated related the subtleties of the capture. His voice consistent and firm, every word felt like a slap in the face. Harris had never really perceived the heaviness of what he had done until he heard Marcus talk. The disappointment, the dread, the weakness in his voice, everything sliced through the room like a daily existence. Marcus wasn't simply recounting his story, he was representing each and every individual who had at any point been abused by the police, everybody who had endured because of an official like Harris. Yet however much Harris attempted to zero in on the procedures, a piece of him couldn't shake the prospect that regardless of what occurred in that court, he had proactively lost. Regardless of whether the jury viewed him not blameworthy, the decision would be insignificant. He had lost his work, his standing and his position locally. Yet more terrible, he had lost his own feeling of who he was. The preliminary at long last came to a nearby, following quite a while of strain. The jury thought for a really long time, the heaviness of their choice looming over the court like a ticking clock. Harris stayed there, the fears gradually working in his chest. The result of this preliminary would decide his opportunity as well as his inheritance. Would he leave that court a liberated individual, or would he face the results of his activity? It was an inquiry that had kept him conscious around evening time, and presently it was the ideal opportunity for a response. When the jury returned, the air was thick with expectation. Harris' hands were sticky as he grasped the edge of his seat. The adjudicator called for quiet. As the jury foreman remained to convey the decision, the room appeared to pause its breathing. The jury tracked down the litigant official Chris Harris at fault for attack and unfortunate behavior in office. The words hit Harris like a punch to the stomach. Briefly everything around him appeared to blur. He could scarcely hear the remainder of the adjudicator's guidelines. As the truth of the conviction got comfortable, he had been viewed as blameworthy. There was no getting away from it. Presently the man he had violated, Marcus, had won and Harris had lost everything. The court ejected in blended responses. Certain individuals cheered, assuaged that a fair consequence had been given. Others remained quiet, their countenances indifferent, as though they too comprehended that this wasn't just about Harris, it was about a lot bigger issue. Marcus' allies, who had been battling for responsibility for such a long time, were presently seeing the primary genuine step toward equity. However, for Harris there was no feeling of triumph in the air. There was just the devastating load of doubt, the acknowledgement that his whole profession had disintegrated under the heaviness of his own activities. The condemning hearing was booked for the next week. However, Harris realized that the harm had as of now been done. The preliminary had shown the world what sort of official he had been, and it wasn't the sort of man anybody needed to be related with. He had lost his profession, his uprightness and his opportunity. The street ahead would be loaded up with fights and court media examination and doubtlessly time in jail. However, the hardest worst part, the part that would torment him until the end of his life, was the way that he had nobody to fault except for himself. The framework had bombed him, yet it had likewise bombed Marcus, and the aggravation of realizing that he had been the one to sustain that pattern of viciousness and bad form was something Harris wasn't sure he might at any point live with. The condemning was the last blow. Harris was given a jail sentence for the attack on Marcus, as well as for the long periods of unfortunate behavior that had at last come to light. The adjudicator, who had paid attention to the declarations and investigated the proof, clarified that this wasn't simply a round one error. It was about an example of conduct that had continued unrestrained for excessively lengthy. Harris had violated the law, however he had additionally broken the trust that the public put in their cops. As the adjudicator passed down the sentence, Harris' contemplations were numb. He had realized it was coming, however listening to the words clearly still felt like a punch to the stomach. Chris Harris, you are thus condemned to 5 years in jail for attack and unfortunate behavior in office. Your activities have harmed the confidence in the police power, and you should pay for the mischief you have caused. The room appeared to shift as Harris' legal advisor provided him with a short look of compassion prior to directing his concentration toward the lawful papers before him. The truth, all things considered, hit Harris like a tsunami. He was going to jail. His profession, his standing, all that he had worked for was gone. In its place was a sentence that would strip him of his opportunity and empower him to stand up to the greatness of his activities each and every day outside the court. The responses were blended. Marcus, who had been a calm, strong presence all through the preliminary, was met with acclaim as he left, his allies applauding the equity they had contended energetically to see. He wasn't observing Harris' destruction, he was praising the way that the framework had worked, that responsibility had been accomplished, and that perhaps, quite possibly, this would be the most important move toward genuine change. Yet Harris didn't want to celebrate anything. He felt just a profound feeling of misfortune, a feeling of disappointment that nothing could fix the aggravation he had caused. As the cuffs were secured around his wrists and he was driven away, he understood that he needed to live with the outcomes of his activities for the rest of his life. There would be no recovery, no path of least resistance. The framework had worked, however. It had worked past the point of no return for himself, and presently he would need to confront the outcomes alone. As Harris was accompanied out of the court, the heaviness of the chains on his clenched hands felt like a horrendous sign of how far he had fallen. Each step, every development appeared to delay as he was driven down the corridor to the holding cells underneath the town hall. His strides reverberated against the virus walls, a distinct difference to the commotion of the court only minutes before. The cheers, the sneers, the heaviness of the public eye, every last bit of it was gone now. Everything that was left was the truth of his activities and the existence he had annihilated. Inside the cell, Harris stood quietly, his back against the virus' substantial wall. His psyche was numb, as yet attempting to handle all that. It wasn't simply the jail sentence that spooky him, it was the acknowledgement that he had been important for something a lot bigger, something that reached out a long ways past the extent of his own life. He had been a little piece of a broken framework, and now that framework had found him, the law, the design he had committed to maintain had betrayed him. He had abused it in manners that couldn't be scattered. The inquiries that had been twirling in his psyche since the preliminary appeared to take on an existence of their own. Consider the possibility that I had done things any other way. Consider the possibility that I had quite recently stood by listening to Marcus. Let him account for himself and discollate the circumstance. Might things at some point have turned out contrastingly? Harris could never know the solution to those inquiries, and that gestured him the most. The uncertainties tormented him, yet he additionally knew that he would need to live with them until the end of his life. The responsibility wasn't something that could be washed away in not many years. It was too profound, too imbued in who he had become. In the days that followed, Harris wound up investing increasingly more energy in his cell, pondering all that he had done. The disconnection was a dependable friend. Jail wasn't what he had envisioned. He had anticipated that it should be cruel, however nothing prearranged him for the devastating dejection, the feeling of double-crossing from those he once called partners, and the disgrace that followed him wherever his legal counselor had cautioned him that he would publicity in a high-security office, a spot where previous police weren't precisely welcome. He would need to look out, hold his head down, and attempt to make do. There were no visits from family. His better half, Lauren, had left him not long after the condemning. The profound cost of his activities had been a lot for her. She had attempted to support him. However, in the end the reality of the situation was excessively weighty to bear. She was unable to remain with a caused such a lot of man torment, not just to Marcus, however, to their family. Harris couldn't fault her. As a matter of fact, a section of him comprehended it. After all, what sort of future might they at some point have now? What kind of relationship might they at some point remake after all that had occurred? And afterward, there was Marcus. Harris had heard from his legal counselor that Marcus was getting along nicely, that he had utilized his recently discovered stage to stand in opposition to the requirement for police change. He was all the while supporting for change, battling for a framework where individuals like him, blameless men who were focused on due to their race, wouldn't need to live in apprehension about being abused by the very individuals who should secure them. Harris had followed Marcus' excursion from jail, perusing the articles, watching the meetings, seeing the improvement that had been made in the battle for equity. The incongruity was that Marcus, the man he had violated, was currently driving the charge for the change Har had neglected to see when it made the biggest difference. The world outside was moving. Individuals were focusing on the discussion Marcus had begun, the one that such countless individuals had been quieted from having. Harris really wanted to feel the sting of his own disappointment, realizing that he had played a part in that quiet. He had been one individuals that had propagated the very frameworks he was presently watching disintegrate, and in that he understood the full degree of his misstep. It wasn't just about the capture, it was about a bigger issue that required resolving, an issue he had been excessively visually impaired, excessively obstinate to see. Weeks transformed into months, and Harris invested more energy reflecting than he of all time had before. The lament was consistent, but there was something different that started to develop inside him, something he didn't know how to manage. Might he at any point make revises? Might he at some point figure out how to add to the battle for equity to help compose the wrongs he had caused? Stopped, he didn't know. Perhaps there was no reclamation for somebody like him except for the thought of basically serving his time and leaving with only his disgrace. Didn't agree with him. Harris' phone was his main sidekick now, and in that seclusion he began to accomplish something he hadn't done in years. He began to listen. He paid attention to the tales of different prisoners, to the aggravation and disappointment they conveyed with them. He began perusing books about the historical backdrop of police, about fundamental prejudice, about the tales of people of color and ladies who had been abused by officials like him. Every story he read, every story he heard felt like a mirror being held up to his face, and the reflection gazing back at him wasn't somebody he perceived, some place where it counts. Harris realized that his process wasn't over. Jail would be his world for a long time to come, yet it was likewise where he would confront the hardest reality of all. He needed to change without precedent for his life. Harris comprehended what it intended to really be considered responsible, not simply by the equity framework, yet without anyone else. And the hardest part was that he was unable to fix what he had caused. The harm had previously been finished to Marcus, to his family, to the local area. He had double-crossed, yet perhaps quite possibly through self-reflection he could track down an approach to make things solidly in anything little way that could be, whether it was figuring out how to advocate for change from inside the jail framework or sharing his story to caution others. Harris acknowledged he needed to work on something until further notice. However, the best anyone could hope for at that point was to sit in the peaceful, his considerations, his, as it were, organization. Months passed, and Harris' life in jail was gradually coming to fruition into something that felt unrecognizable. The days were for quite some time loaded up with dull schedules and the consistent murmur of a harsh reality that folded itself over him like a thick haze. The responsibility was dependably there, however. As time went on, it became something he was unable to get away from. It wasn't simply the weight of his conviction or the hard walls of the jail that characterized his days, it was the weighty presence of his own soul. Harris had turned into an alternate man, as in he was presently living with a clearness he hadn't had in years. There were minutes in the quiet of his cell when his contemplations would meander back to the day he captured Marcus, the brutality of it, the disarray all over, the way his obstruction had been met with viciousness as opposed to understanding. Each time the memory re-emerged it seemed like a new twisted, yet after some time those injuries had started to mend, not on the grounds that they were no more, but since Harris had begun to confront them, to take apart every choice choice he had made the day he had been so visually impaired, so self-important, so persuaded that his identification gave him the option to control what is going on, to overwhelm it with practically no thought for the man remaining before him. However, Marcus had been an individual, a human being with trust streams and an option to carry on with his life liberated from dread. Harris had overlooked that, he had disregarded that, and he was paying for it now in the beginning of his sentence. Harris had been consumed by outrage at Marcus, outrage at the framework, even indignation at himself. However, the resentment at last blurred, supplanted by a profound hurting distress. He could always be unable to fix the harm he had caused, yet in the long calm hours of his constrainment Harris had come to comprehend that distress wasn't sufficient. Lament, as strong as it was, couldn't destroy the story. In the event that there was any reclamation, it would come from activity, genuine cement activity. Something that had struck him the most was the manner in which different detainees had answered him. At first he had been disconnected, a previous cop in a jail where many had encountered firsthand the fierceness he had addressed. He was despised, doubted, and dealt with like an untouchable. His name had spread through the office like quickly. He was the cop who had abused an honest man, and in this place there was no pardon for that. He had been compromised, irritated, and stayed away from by most. However, as time wore on, he started to see something startling. A portion of the prisoners had started to pay attention to him. They needed to hear what he had to say regarding the capture, about the manner in which the framework worked, about his perspectives on regulation, authorization, and the shameful acts individuals like them had endured because of officials like him. Harris didn't have the foggiest idea how to feel about this recently discovered consideration. On one hand, he felt an odd feeling of obligation. Perhaps this was his opportunity, as a single and open door, to have a little effect on begin repaying the obligation he owed. Then again he realized he didn't reserve the option to remain before anybody. Furthermore, teach about equity not after what he had done. The pietism was suffocating, yet in spite of his subtle conflict he started to stand up. Probably at first, yet over the long haul all the more straightforwardly he began little sharing his encounters, recognizing his disappointments, and straightforwardly talking about how his own decisions had hurt Marcus as well as the local area, the division, and the very nation he had committed to safeguard. He talked about the errors he had made, the foundational issues that permitted officials like him to continue without some kind of restraint, and the profound decay that had flourished in the very organizations intended to serve equity. It wasn't simple. The detainees didn't acknowledge him. They tested him, doubted his thought processes, and called him out on his past. However, for Harris the challenge wasn't simply a method for shielding himself. It was an approach to at last start standing up to the man he had been, the man who had manhandled his power, who had imagined that the identification was a safeguard from responsibility. And gradually he started to see a change by the way others saw him as well as by the way he saw himself. Harris actually couldn't fix what he had done, yet he could assume liability. He could work to comprehend the damage he had caused and focus on being a piece of the discussion on change, even from inside the jail walls. One night, sitting in the faint light of his cell, Harris found himself self-composing. He had begun keeping a diary, a spot where he could put down his viewpoints, his second thoughts, his expectations. It wasn't a lot, however it was something. He expounded on Marcus, what he envisioned Marcus' life had been like after that day, what his own life could have been had he not pursued that pivotal choice. He expounded on the battle for equity, about police ruthlessness, about foundational prejudice, and about how he had been a piece of that framework. He expounded on the prisoners he had met, men who like him had committed errors, however, who had likewise seen the imperfections in a framework that bombed them endlessly time again. In one of his diary passages he composed, "I never suspected I'd wind up here. I never suspected I'd be the one following through on the cost. Be that as it may, I am and I should be. I removed somebody's poison. Presently I'm paying the cost for it, yet perhaps quite possibly I can utilize this opportunity to make it right, not for me, however, for individuals I hurt, for market, for every one of them." The more he composed, the more he understood that his excursion toward recovery would not have been a straight one. There would be no convenient solutions, no simple responses, yet what he had started to comprehend was that change, genuine change, needed to come from inside. The framework won't fix itself. Individuals like like him officials, legislators, residents needed to get that change going one choice at a period, and perhaps quite possibly he could add to that change even from jail, even after all that he had done. Yet the way to recovery was still long, and Harris wasn't tricking himself into feeling that a couple of words or activities could eradicate the long periods of damage he had caused. He would need to live with his missteps until the end of his life. However, he won't let those botches characterize him perpetually. In the quietness of his cell, Harris at last perceived how it affected, really confronted the outcomes of his activities, and it was the hardest thing he'd at any point needed to do. Years passed, and Harris' life inside the jail walls became something far not quite the same as the existence he had once realized. He had turned into a man characterized not by his identification but rather by the scars of his past choices. The jail had constrained him to stand up to the truth of who he was, the botches, the presumption, the mercilessness, and to agonizingly start the long street gradually to understanding his days were not generally loaded up with outrage or disavowal. However, with calm reflection and an assurance to change regardless of whether it was in the littlest ways, Harris realized he could never be liberated from the responsibility, the disgrace. He knew that no matter the number of diary passages he composed, regardless of the number of discussions he had with individual detainees about equity and change, he could never fix the mischief he had caused. However, he could change, and maybe more significantly, he could attempt to have an effect regardless of how little. For individuals he had violated the framework that had once safeguarded him, that had permitted him to work without result, had likewise bombed Marcus and endless others like him. That reality weighed intensely on Harris consistently. The more he talked with different men in the jail, the more he comprehended the number of them like him had succumbed to the very framework they had once thought would safeguard them. There were men here who had been survivors of over-policing, racial profiling, and a messed-up equity framework. Some had committed errors, indeed, yet others had been up to speed in a framework that made them pay. Harris had turned into a hesitant audience, hearing accounts of viciousness and unjustifiable treatment, and interestingly, he was at this point not the one remaining in judgment. He was the one listening, the one attempting to figure out the framework that was bombing so many. One evening, after a long discussion with a went-through detainee years battling an improper conviction, Harris sat in his cell and felt the heaviness of all that he had come to acknowledge. He had been on the opposite side of the identification for such a long time, standing as a delegate of the law. However, presently he was remaining on the opposite side, hearing the narratives of those he had once passed judgment on. A portion of these men had been survivors of the very framework that had safeguarded him, and it occurred to him that he also had been a casualty, only not in the way he had at any point envisioned. He had been important for a framework that should have been fixed, yet had been excessively oblivious in regards to see the breaks. Until it was past the point of no return, Harris began to ponder Marcus, the man he had violated. He had seen Marcus' name in the news, looked as he turned into a non-entity in the battle for equity. He had heard the assemblies, the discourses, and the developing energy for police change. However, what struck him the most was the tranquil strength Marcus had displayed and the repercussions of his illegitimate capture. Marcus hadn't looked for vengeance. He wasn't consumed by disdain or outrage. Rather, he had transformed his torment into a weapon for change. Harris had watched from jail as Marcus worked energetically to look for equity for himself as well as to push for fundamental change. In his diary, Harris composed consistently, "I consider Marcus of what he's finished since the day I consider how he took the most obviously terrible thing that could happen to an individual and utilized it to construct something better. How often have I seen individuals attempt to separate him, to tear him, yet he keeps standing." Perhaps that is what equity resembles in the court as well as in the manner in which we carry on with our lives, the manner in which we battle for the people who have been violated. I can't change the past, yet in the event that I can learn anything from Marcus, it's that I can in any case make something out of this, regardless of whether it's simply being straightforward with myself and attempting to pay attention to those I disregarded for such a long time. After some time, Harris had started to discover a little feeling of harmony. It wasn't harmony in the manner a great many people would think about. It's anything but a tranquility of psyche or independence from result, yet it was a sort of harmony that came from realizing he was at last taking obligation regarding the man he had been. He wasn't pardoning his activities, he wasn't attempting to legitimize them. He had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. However, in jail he had begun the long course of tuning in, of attempting to figure out and of gradually recognizing the master plan. One day a jail social specialist came to converse with him about a local area outreach program intended to show prisoners about the equity framework and how they could help push for change. It was anything but a way Harris had at any point thought to be, yet as the laborer talked about the potential for change, Harris felt something mix inside him. Here was an opportunity to be important, for an option that could be greater than himself. He wasn't sure what far he could go, how much meaningful he could have from in jail, yet he realized that this was the kind of thing he could do. It wasn't recovery, there was no reclamation from what he had done, yet it was something, a stage anyway. Little in the correct bearing, Harris pursued the program. He began conversing with other prisoners about what he had found out about his own excursion of self-reflection and about the significance of understanding the framework that had bombed him. The more he talked, the more he understood the amount of he possessed to advance, the amount he still didn't have any idea yet. He likewise realized that there was no option but to press onward. Now he couldn't unsee what he had seen. He was unable to fail to remember the essences of the people he had violated, and he was unable to disregard the cries for equity that kept on reverberating in his psyche. Months transformed into years, and Harris' change was slow yet genuine. He actually battled with the heaviness of his past, yet he realized he was unique. Presently the street he had voyaged had been long, agonizing, and loaded up with results he would never get away yet. It was likewise a street that had here and there showed him what it intended to really defy himself, to pay attention, to learn, and maybe in particular to be essential for the necessary change and erect framework. In his last diary section, Harris composed, "I won't ever pardon myself for how I treated Marcus. I'll always be unable to take it back, yet perhaps I can help other people see what I couldn't. Perhaps some way or another the examples I've learned can help another person stay away from the mix-ups I made. That is everything I can do well, that is everything any of us can do. Begin from where we are and attempt to have an effect regardless of how little." It was anything but a reclamation story, and it was the upset completion Harris had once envisioned for himself. Yet in those calm minutes behind the virus walls of the jail, Harris had tracked down something that interestingly felt like harmony, a pledge to change, an eagerness to tune in, and a longing to help other people find the very opportunity that he had underestimated such an extremely long time back. In the event that you like this video, if it's not too much trouble, offer it to go ahead, share your considerations in the remarks, and make a point to buy in for additional recordings like this. Gratitude for observing.